Well, most of us, when we first come to Christianity, when we first begin the Christian journey, we get all excited and we're ready to change and we want to overcome our sins and we're struggling and we're succeeding and we're changing and we're cleaning up our lives and we develop this piety. And yet really what we're doing for the most part is grossly overestimating ourselves and underestimating God. But then God leaves us struggling with those real sins, those sins that reflect our very nature, those sins that are our old self. And when we sin, every time we sin, we're not showing God, He already knows. We're demonstrating to ourselves that we are still willing to put something before God. Every time we sin, we show how little we love God, how little we love, and how imperfect we are. And so this struggle helps us see through that very selfish, very human piety that thinks way too much of ourselves. It brings down to earth the spiritual pride that infects so many of us in Christianity. It helps us see how inadequate we really are and how easy it is for us to choose self over love, to put something before God. It helps us to see ourselves. So here is this first reason, and as we do this, we come to what we might say self-knowledge. We thought we were fairly good, whether it's our human good, and then maybe we come to Christianity and we think we're developing God's good. But really we come to see, as we continue and persist in our sinfulness, because God has not fully taken it away by changing our nature, we see that we really weren't so good after all. We see how easy it is for us to put self before love. We start to see how ugly we really are. We thought we were pretty good. And we thought this good was normal. But now that we see the world in terms of self versus love, I kind of apologize to you. Because when our eyes are open to see the world in these terms of love versus self, suddenly the world becomes a much uglier place than we thought it was. That all that love that we thought was out there, and all that good that we thought was out there, and most of that beauty that we thought was out there, we see is really stained. It's so tainted with our slavery to self. At the same time, when we then see real love, when we see true, godly, divine, true selfless love, after seeing how selfish all this other love is and having our eyes opened, we see just how unbelievably beautiful that love is. And so all at once the world becomes simultaneously a much uglier place, but also more beautiful beyond what we ever imagined. And we see just how beautiful love is. And that brings us to the second reason for our struggle against sin. First, it shows us how little we love God and how much we fail, how much we really miss the mark, how much we truly sin when we realize it's that selfishness that may start off as something small, but in the human business it snowballs until we have war and we have terrorism and we have crime and we have poverty. It's all those little selfishnesses that add up. But having come to see ourselves, the struggle against sin also leads us now to see God. And instead of this very human, selfish, overestimating piety that we first have as Christians, now instead of being led into despair by seeing how selfish and how ugly and how sinful we really are, instead we rejoice because we look at the beauty of God, a God who always, always is loving, who never, not once, ever in all eternity, not once has put self over love, whereas we do it so easily when we're left to sin. And we look at that God and we begin to see there is the beauty of holiness. I can't begin to imagine now that I see myself accurately and see how hard it is to be selfless all the time, that there is a God who has never once failed. There is a Jesus who walked the earth in the same body that I have and never once sinned, never once put self before love. We look at that and we say, you're beautiful, God. Your holiness is so beautiful. And that's what you call me to. One day, I will never again hurt other people because of my selfishness. One day, I will never more tear apart the fabric of society because I exploited another human being, either because I was just overwhelmed by my need to take care of myself or because I chose self. One day, because of you, you will make me like you, and I will never again hurt another person by my selfishness. God, you've never done that. How beautiful you are. And so the first two reasons for the struggle against sin are to humble that spiritual pride. And when it's humbled, we begin to truly see ourselves, we come to self-knowledge, and we come to God knowledge. We come to see the real Christian journey. This journey from now what we thought was really pretty good, now we see, oh, it's ugly. So stained by our slavery to self. Journeying by the grace of God, not by our own self-will. Our self-will has showed us that we're so willing to put something before love. But by God's grace, by God working in our lives, we come to that beauty of holiness. That's what God has promised to do for us. That's what He will do with the human business. Make us divine, eternally sustainable love. And now when we start embarking upon this means of overcoming sin, yielding ourselves, abandoning ourselves to God's grace to change our nature, not trusting in our own self-discipline, now we start seeing the third reason for the struggle. It begins to become a barometer of our growth. Now, as we encounter sin, as we encounter temptation, as God begins transforming us, we can take heart when we see that we are gaining the victory over sin. That as we stop doing it by our effort and our self-will, although we still fight against sin, we now become encouraged when we see, yeah, there are times when that sin used to be so attractive to me. And now by God's grace, not by my struggling against it. The struggle was to show me how much I went for it. But now that I've yielded myself to God working within me, I'm no longer tempted. It's kind of bouncing off. Wow, that's pretty neat. So we begin to measure the transformation as the struggle against sin begins to wane. Yes, it's always there. We're always hit with them. Paul talked about it in Romans 7, his own struggle with sin. But we see this barometer of reflecting God's growth in us as we struggle against sin and find it is starting to find less fertile ground in us. It is starting to become as attractive as hot tar. Now, as this fertile ground for sin is removed and replaced with fertile ground for love, suddenly we come to the most remarkable freedom. An incredible freedom when we begin to throw off the shackles of our slavery to self that chooses for self either by choice or because it's just overwhelmed trying to take care of self by our inputs. And we become free of that slavery, free to be able to choose to love. A freedom that's so beautiful. Let's take a look at Galatians 5, where Paul discusses this freedom.